In the last video in the LAMP stack tutorial series, we used PHP programming to dynamically display the proper page navigation based on the page we were viewing in the browser. In this video, we'll begin to dynamically display the content on the contacts page instead of hard-coding the code and the data for each of the cards. In order to do this, we'll need to store the data for each contact somewhere, because we'll need to access all the data dynamically to populate the elements as we build them. And the place we're going to store that data is in a database. So before we actually start building the page content dynamically, we need to discuss databases. If we launch the MAMP application and click on the Web Start icon, we'll be taken to the MAMP homepage, which is being served on our local machine. It's the default index.php page in the htdocs folder, which comes when MAMP installs the Apache web server. On this page, we'll see that MAMP is using the MySQL database. It's the M in the LAMP stack. MySQL is an open source relational database management system. What that means is that it's an application used to manage relational databases. And when you think of relational databases, think of data stored in tables, columns, and rows. For example, take a spreadsheet. Although a spreadsheet is managed by a spreadsheet application, such as Microsoft Excel, for this discussion, think of it as a relational database management engine. And in this spreadsheet, what we're looking at is one database in the system. And the spreadsheet consists of a tab named Contacts, which in database terminology we would refer to as a table. And there are rows and columns in the table. At the top of each column, we've defined a name for the data that the column will hold. For instance, in this column, we'll store the ID for the contact. In this column, the name, this the email, and finally the cell phone number. The rows across the table store the actual data, one row for each contact. Now, for this to actually be considered a relational database, we'd have to add another table which has data related to the contacts in this table, such as blog posts if this were a blog application. But for our contacts app, all we need is one simple table. If we go back to the MAMP homepage, in the MySQL section, we'll see that we can administer the MySQL database with the PHP MyAdmin application. So I'll open this link in another tab, and it'll take us to PHP MyAdmin screen. On this page, if we click the Databases tab, we'll see some of the default databases that come with the MySQL installer. What we want to do is create a database to hold the contacts for our application. So I'll give the database a name of my_contacts and click Create. Now we can add a table, and the table we want to create is contacts, and we want 4 columns. Now we can give our columns the names and specify the data types. So if we go back to our spreadsheet, the first column we want is ID, then name, followed by email and cell. So we'll give this column a name of ID. Its data type will be an integer, so it's a number, and then we can move down and create the name column. This will be a data type of varchar for variable character. Email comes next, that's a varchar as well, and cell, which will be a varchar. Next, we need to set the max length for the varchar columns. For the name, we'll set that to 256 characters, just to make sure we have room to store very long names. We'll also set the email to 256, and for the cell phone number, we'll set this to 25. This will allow for several types of phone number formats, although this is something we would really handle in our application code to ensure proper formatting of the input data. Now we can click Save, and our table has been created. Now, before we could start using the table, we have to set a primary key. A primary key is a unique constraint that identifies each record in a table, so each row. Primary keys must contain unique values and cannot contain null, so they can't be empty or contain a data type known as null, which we'll talk about at a later time. A table can have only one primary key And in the table, the primary key can consist of single or multiple column fields. In our database, we'll just select one field, the ID, which we want to be unique for each contact, and then click the primary button. We'll also mark the column as unique and set it as the index. And we'll mark the email and cell columns as unique as well. And now our table is built and we could start putting data into it. We'll do this by going to the Insert tab and then entering the values for our contacts. So our first row will be for Stacy. She'll have an ID of 1, copy her name, her email address, and her cell phone number. So let's jump back into the admin screen. We'll give her ID a value of 1, her name, copy the email, and cell number, and click Go. Now this builds an insert statement for us, and this is code that is executed by the database management system that will insert a row into the contacts table. It will set values for ID, name, email, and cell equal to the values of 1 for the ID, name, email, and phone number. So before we execute this, we want to duplicate it for the other 8 contacts and change the values to those that are appropriate for the contacts we want to enter. Okay, with the insert statements updated, I can now click Go to execute the commands. And we can see our data is now inserted into the table. If I click on the Search tab and then click Go, it'll return all of the rows. I could also go to the SQL tab and create my own SQL statement. So what I want to do is select everything from the contacts table. If I click Go, I get the same results. So now we have a database named My Contacts with a table named Contacts, which has data for all the contacts that we want to display in our application. And we know how to get this data from the database by executing the select statement. The next thing for us to do is go back to our PHP code and see how to connect it to this database, and then use that data to dynamically populate the cards for each contact on the contacts page. And that's what we'll do in the next video.